We left everything we owned in the dark, on foot, with one rifle and 11 bullets, because whatever was standing outside our walls that night had already made up its mind about us. And the only question left was whether we were smart enough to understand that. I'm writing this from a hospital bed. The doctors use the word, quote, zero a lot lately, which I've learned is their way of saying something they don't want to say directly. My daughter came in yesterday and put a notebook on the table next to the water jug. She said, "Dad, write something down. Anything. Just leave something." So I'm leaving this. 81 years old, and I've never told this story in full to a single person outside our family. Not because I was ashamed, not because I thought people wouldn't believe me. I kept it quiet for the same reason you keep a wound covered. The moment you expose it to air, it starts doing something again. This happened when I was 17 years old. It lasted 11 days. And before I go any further, I want to be honest with you about something. I spent most of my adult life trying to build a wall between myself and those 11 days. I got married, raised kids, worked a job I was good at, lived a life that looked completely normal from the outside. And it was normal. I want to be clear about that. But underneath it, always, was this. These 11 days. Sitting there like something sealed in a jar that you know better than to open, but can never quite bring yourself to throw away. I remember the smell of that hospital waiting room where we finally stopped running. Cheap floor cleaner and stale coffee, and the particular kind of silence that only exists in places where people are waiting for bad news. I remember sitting there in clothes I'd worn for 2 days straight, my hands still not completely steady, thinking. We actually made it. We actually got out. And then thinking the thing I didn't want to think. It let us go. There's a difference between those two things, and it matters. People ask me, or they used to ask me, why I never went back. Why my father never went back. Why no one in our family ever drove that road again after we left. And I used to give a version of the answer that left out the parts I wasn't ready to talk about. I'd say the land was sold. I'd say it was too far. I'd say we'd made a life somewhere else and there wasn't a reason to. All of that was true. None of it was the real answer. The real answer is that you don't go back to a place that looked at you through a cracked window in the dark and knew exactly who you were. You just don't. I'm writing this now because I am running out of time to write it, and because my daughter asked me to leave something, and because I think there's a version of the truth that deserves to exist somewhere outside of my own head before I'm no longer here to carry it. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm 81 years old, and I'm past the point of needing that. I'm just going to tell you what happened, exactly what happened. Starting from the beginning, even though the beginning, when you're living it, doesn't look like a beginning at all. It just looks like a normal Tuesday on a piece of land your father worked himself half to death to own. If this kind of story means something to you, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and there's a lot more where this came from. My father, Walter, was not a man who frightened easily. I want to establish that clearly before I tell you anything else, because it matters for everything that comes after. He was a former logger, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than skin. He'd taken a chunk of raw scrub land and turned it into a working cattle property over 4 years of labor that would have broken most people twice. He didn't complain. He didn't quit. He treated setbacks the way a river treats a rock. He just went around them and kept moving. My mother, Margaret, was sharper than him in the ways that counted. She ran the actual household, kept the finances, made the decisions that my father thought he was making. She was the one who noticed things first, always. Not because she was anxious, but because she paid attention in a way my father sometimes forgot to. My younger brother Danny was 10 that year, all elbows and questions. My little sister Ellie was 5, and she had this way of going completely still and quiet when something felt wrong, like an animal. I didn't understand that about her then. I understand it now. Our hired hand, Ray, had been with us 2 seasons. He was an ex-military man, quiet and competent, with the particular economy of movement that men get when they've spent years in situations where unnecessary motion costs something. He slept in the smaller outbuilding about 30 feet from the main house. He kept to himself. He was exactly what you'd want in a man working a remote property. We were 40 miles from the nearest town, down a dirt road that turned to red mud in the wet season. The nearest neighbor was a cattle family called the Hargraves, and they were 12 miles south. 12 miles on a good day felt like nothing. At 3 in the morning, with no lights and something in the trees, 12 miles felt like the distance between planets. I said my father wasn't a man who frightened easily. What I should add is this: he was also not a man who asked questions he wasn't ready to hear the answers to. When he bought the land, he knew it had been abandoned twice before. He knew he'd gotten it cheap for reasons the previous owners hadn't put in writing. He chose not to dig into that. He needed the land. It was the right size, the right price, the right distance from water. He made a practical decision, and he moved his family onto a property that 2 other families had walked away from in a hurry. And he told himself it was because those other men didn't have what he had. He told himself that right up until the morning I came running back from the northern fence line and told him what I'd found pressed into the dry clay ground. And the look on his face told me he'd been waiting for something, without knowing what the something was, since the day we arrived. The prints in the clay were so large that my brain refused to process them as footprints for a full 3 or 4 seconds. I just stood there staring at them like they were some kind of trick of the light, some weird erosion pattern, something the rain had done. Except there hadn't been rain in 3 weeks, and I knew it, and the ground knew it, and whatever had made those impressions had pressed them more than 2 inches deep into soil that was almost as hard as packed concrete. I'd gone out that morning the same way I went out every morning, before breakfast, before anyone else was up, walk the fence line, check the herd, make sure nothing had shifted overnight. It was a routine I'd had since we arrived, and routines have a way of making you feel like the world is predictable, which is exactly why they're dangerous. You stop really looking. You just move through the motions and let your eyes slide over things. That morning, my eyes almost slid right over the first print. It was near the 3rd fence post from the northern corner, half in shadow still. And what made me stop was not the shape of it, but the depth. The way the ground just dropped away there in a way ground doesn't drop away on its own. I crouched down. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at the next one, and the one after that. They ran along the outside of the fence line, heading east, 7 of them in a loose walking stride, each one pressed into that bone-dry clay like the thing that made them weighed as much as a small vehicle. I put my own foot next to the closest one, and my boot, which was not a small boot, fit inside it the way a child's shoe fits inside a man's. I went and got my father. I didn't run back to the house. I want to be honest about that. I walked quickly, because some part of me understood that running would mean admitting out loud to myself what I was already thinking, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. My father was at the kitchen table with his coffee when I came in. He looked at my face and put the cup down without drinking from it. He didn't ask me anything. He just stood up and followed me out. He crouched beside the first print the same way I had. He didn't say anything for a long time. He measured the stride with his own boot steps, counting quietly under his breath. He measured the width of the print with his hand spread from thumb to little finger, and then did it again like he thought the first measurement had to be wrong. Ray came out of the small outbuilding, saw us both crouching by the fence, and walked over. He looked down at the prints and said nothing. The three of us stood there in the early morning light with the cattle making their usual sounds behind us and the birds starting up in the scrub to the north, and nobody said a single word for what felt like a very long time. Then Ray said, quietly, that no animal he knew of walked upright and left a print that size. My father said he knew that. Then he said he was going to reinforce the fence. He said it like that was the relevant response, like the answer to something that didn't fit into any category he had was to go find a piece of wire and make the fence stronger. I understood even then that this was how my father managed things that frightened him. He found the nearest practical task and he attacked it. It was actually one of the things I respected most about him. But standing there that morning, watching him walk back toward the barn to get the wire, I felt something shift inside me that I don't think ever fully shifted back. Because the prints weren't random. They ran along our fence line in a straight, deliberate path from west to east. Whatever made them hadn't been wandering. It had been following the boundary of our property. It had been walking the perimeter like it was measuring something. My father recorded the measurements that evening in the property record book he kept for cattle counts and rainfall and supply costs. He wrote it down in the same handwriting he used to log everything else. Flat, factual, no comment. Dimensions, depth, stride length. He wrote the words bipedal and upright, and then he closed the book and put it back on the shelf, and we had dinner, and nobody mentioned it. But here's the thing about my father that I've turned over in my mind for 60 years since. When he bought that land, there was a detail he didn't share with us until much later. And I mean much later. I was in my 30s, sitting with him on the porch of the house we'd moved to after everything, when he finally mentioned it like it was something he'd just remembered, which I'm certain it was not. He told me that when he'd first gone to sign the papers on the property, the solicitor handling the sale had mentioned, almost in passing, that the land had changed hands twice in the previous decade. He'd said the first man who held it had walked off inside a year. He'd said the second family had lasted a bit longer, but had also left without selling their stock, which was unusual, and without giving any explanation that anyone had written down. My father had asked the solicitor why the land was priced so low. The solicitor had said something about the remoteness, the road conditions, the lack of infrastructure. My father had accepted that answer. He'd needed to accept it because he needed the land. And sometimes needing something badly enough makes a man's hearing go selectively quiet on the parts of a conversation that might complicate the decision he's already made. He signed the papers. He moved us out there. He built the fence and the outbuilding and the small yard for the horses, and he worked that land for 4 years before August came, and the ground started showing us what had been there long before we were. What I've never been able to decide, even now, is whether knowing about those previous families would have changed anything. I used to think yes. I used to think if he'd just asked one more question, pushed back on that too easy answer about the road conditions, we'd have found out enough to walk away before we started. But the older I get, the less sure I am about that. My father was the kind of man who built things. Leaving was not in his vocabulary. It's possible he would have heard everything and signed the papers anyway, and told himself he was different, he was tougher, he'd stick it out where the others hadn't. It's possible the ending was always going to be the same. The only variable was how long we'd have to endure before we got there, and what it would cost us. What it cost us started becoming clear on the fourth morning, when my mother came to find my father before breakfast and told him that every horse on the property was standing pressed together in the center of the yard, all of them facing south, trembling in a way she'd never seen horses tremble, and none of them making a sound. My mother was not a woman who panicked. I need you to understand that before I tell you what her face looked like when she came to get my father that morning. Because if you didn't know her, you might read her expression wrong. She wasn't panicking. She was doing the thing she always did when something was genuinely wrong, which was go completely still and quiet, like all the noise in her just switched off, and what was left was this flat, precise attention. She came to the barn where my father was working, stood in the doorway, and said, "Walter, come and look at the horses." That was all. But the way she said it made my father put down what he was holding immediately, without asking why. I followed them out. I don't know why. Some instinct, maybe, or just the way both of them were moving, which was the way adults move when they're trying not to communicate urgency to the children nearby, but failing at it. We came around the side of the house, and I saw the horses, and I stopped walking. There were 5 of them, all 5 pressed together in the center of the yard like they were trying to occupy the same square foot of ground. They were facing south, away from the tree line, and they were trembling. Not the small shiver a horse does when it's cold or when a fly lands wrong. This was a deep, continuous trembling that ran through all 5 of them at once, like they were all connected to the same current, and they were completely silent. No stamping, no snorting, none of the usual restless noise horses make when something disturbs them. Just this silent, collective shaking, all 5 animals pressed flank to flank, staring south at the fence as if the fence was the only safe thing left in the world. Ray came out of the small outbuilding, took one look, and walked over slowly. He stood beside my father for a moment. Then he said that in 20 years of working with horses, he had never seen anything like it. My father said nothing. He walked to the nearest horse, put his hand on its neck, and the animal flinched so hard it nearly took his arm with it. The horse didn't bolt. It just shuddered and pressed harder into the animals beside it. My father stood with his hand still raised where the horse's neck had been and looked at the tree line to the north. He looked at it for a long time. We all did. There was nothing there, just the scrub, the pale, thin trunks of the trees, the shadow between them that got deeper the further in you looked. Nothing moving, no sound from that direction. The birds that usually made noise in those trees in the morning were quiet. That was the thing I noticed second, after the horses. The birds. Every morning since we'd arrived, there had been birds in that northern scrub from first light. That morning, there was nothing. Just silence coming from that direction, like the silence itself was a presence, like something had cleared the space of everything that normally lived there. My father turned away from the tree line and told me to go inside and stay with Danny and Ellie. I wanted to argue. I was 17, and I thought that being 17 meant I was close enough to grown that I deserved to know what was happening. But something in his voice that morning closed the argument before I could start it. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table with my brother and sister, and I listened to the sound of my father and Ray moving around the yard, their voices low and short, no wasted words. That was the morning the property stopped feeling like home and started feeling like something else. Something I didn't have a word for then. I have a word for it now. A trap. Not a trap that had been set for us specifically, nothing that deliberate or personal. More like the kind of trap that exists whether anyone intends it or not. The way a house built on bad ground is a trap. The way water that looks still can be a trap. We had moved ourselves into a position without understanding the position, and now the ground was showing us what it was. The horses never fully settled after that morning. They'd eat, they'd drink, they'd let you work with them, but there was a new quality to them, a kind of hair-trigger readiness that hadn't been there before. Ray said quietly to my father a few days later that he'd never trusted a property that the animals didn't trust. My father didn't respond to that directly, but he'd heard it. I could tell by the way his jaw tightened slightly and then released. What I didn't know that morning, what none of us knew, was that something had happened in the night while we were all asleep that the horses had been awake for. We found out about it 2 days later, almost by accident, when Ray was checking the ground around the perimeter of the outbuilding and found something pressed into the dry dirt on the north-facing side. Not footprints this time. Something different. A long, shallow scrape in the soil, like something had crouched there for an extended period of time. The scrape was close to the wall, maybe 18 inches from the timber, and it wasn't from that morning. Ray said the edges were slightly crusted, dried out, which meant it had been made at least a day earlier. Possibly the same night the horses had pressed themselves together and refused to move. Something had been crouching beside the outbuilding in the dark while Ray slept inside it. It had stayed long enough to leave a mark in the ground. And then it had gone, silently, the way it always went, leaving nothing behind except the evidence that it had been there, patient and still, in the dark 1.5 feet from the wall. Ray looked at that scrape in the ground for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at my father. My father looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. But that evening, for the first time, my father cleaned the rifle without anyone asking him to, and he set it by the door before we went to sleep. And in the morning, it was still there. And we all understood, without discussing it, that it was going to stay there from now on. The sounds started 3 nights after that, and once they started, they didn't stop. The first sound came at around 11 at night, and it went straight through the walls, like the walls weren't there. Not loud. That's the thing people always get wrong when I try to describe it. They expect me to say it was this enormous roar, something that rattled the windows and woke the whole house in a panic. It wasn't like that at all. It was low, deep in a way that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears, like the lowest note of an instrument you've never encountered before. It started somewhere in the northern scrub, and it built slowly, held for several seconds, and then dropped away into silence. And then, from a different direction, slightly east of the first, something answered it. I was awake when it happened. I'd been lying on my back in the dark for over an hour already, staring at the ceiling, listening to the property the way you listen to a building when you're not sure what woke you. The moment I heard it, I went completely still. Not out of any conscious decision. My body just stopped moving on its own. The way it stops when something primitive in your brain takes over and overrides everything else. I lay there and I listened to that exchange in the dark, that call and response between the trees, and I felt the hair on my arm stand up in a way I'd never felt before and haven't felt since. My father was already at the window. I don't know when he'd gotten up, When I came out of my room, he was standing at the main room shutter, with it cracked maybe half an inch, looking out, the rifle in his right hand, with the barrel pointed at the floor. My mother was in the doorway of the bedroom behind me. We didn't speak. We stood in the dark of that main room and listened to the sounds move through the scrub outside, passing back and forth, sometimes overlapping, sometimes answering each other with what seemed like impossible precision, like something that understood the concept of conversation. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. Just stopped, all at once, like a switch had been thrown. The silence that came after was different from the silence before. Fuller, somehow. Heavier. My father stood at the shutter for another few minutes without moving. Then he closed it carefully and turned around. He looked at my mother and then at me, and then he said, "More than one. At least two. Maybe three." That was all he said. He went back to bed. I went back to bed. None of us slept. The sounds came back the following night, and the night after. Same pattern, same hour, same call and response moving through the scrub to the north and east. By the third night, Danny had started waking up from them. He'd appear in the doorway of the room he shared with me, 10 years old and hollow-eyed, not saying anything, just standing there until my mother came and took him back. Ellie slept through them somehow, or seemed to, though later I'd wonder about that. My mother began keeping a candle burning in the main room after dark. She didn't explain why. She just did it, and none of us said anything about it, because we all understood. Here's what I remember most from those nights. Not the sounds themselves, as bad as they were. What I remember is the quality of waiting that filled the house between sunset and when they started. The way dinner became a mechanical thing, food going in without anyone tasting it. The way my father would clean something that didn't need cleaning. The rifle, a piece of tack, the hinges on the door, just to have something to do with his hands. The way my mother would find small tasks near the center of the house, away from the walls. We were all listening, all the time. Even in the middle of a sentence, even in the middle of a meal, part of every one of us was always listening for what came from the north. On the fourth night, my father made a decision. He told Ray at dinner that he was going to sit outside after dark and get a proper look at whatever was making the sounds. Ray said he'd sit with him. My mother said nothing, which was not the same as agreeing. She put Ellie to bed early, and she kept Danny close, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded on top of it and said nothing, and that silence was louder than anything else in the room. My father and Ray went out at around 9. They sat on the veranda on the south side of the house, which gave them a sight line across the yard to the northern fence and the tree line beyond it. My father had the rifle. Ray had a long-handled tool he'd taken from the barn, not as a weapon exactly, more as something to hold. I watched them go out, and then I went to the main room window, and I stood there in the dark, and I watched the dark outside, and I waited. They came back inside just before 1 in the morning. Ray went straight to his outbuilding without speaking. My father came into the main room and sat down in the chair by the cold stove, and he sat there for a while, without saying anything. I was still awake. I was always still awake. I asked him what he'd seen. He said they'd seen shapes at the tree line. More than one. Upright, moving between the trunks, stopping, moving again. He said at one point one of them had come close enough to the fence that he could see the outline of it clearly against the slightly lighter color of the open ground. He said it was tall. He said tall in a way that had a weight to it, like the word itself wasn't quite large enough for what he was describing. He said he'd fired once, not at anything, into the air above the fence line, just to see what would happen. And he said they hadn't run. They'd stepped back, slowly, without any hurry at all, like something that had simply decided, of its own accord, to move back a little. Not because it was afraid, because it chose to. He picked up the rifle from where he'd set it against the wall, and he turned it over in his hands once and set it back down. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, that he didn't think the gun was going to be the thing that settled this. I asked him what was going to settle it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said he didn't know yet, but the way he said it told me he was starting to. What none of us knew yet was that while my father and Ray had been watching the tree line from the south side of the house, something had been at the east wall. Not at the fence, at the wall of the house itself. We didn't find out about that until the next morning, and the way we found out was not the way any of us would have chosen. What we found on the east wall the next morning was a handprint. Not a human handprint. Something larger, pressed into a thin patch of dried mud that had collected at the base of the iron panels where the rain gutter had leaked all season. 5 distinct points above a wide, heavy palm. The whole thing was nearly twice the width of my father's hand spread fully open. It was at shoulder height on my father, which meant whatever had made it had been reaching slightly downward when it pressed against the wall. It had been standing right there, at the wall of the house where my mother and siblings slept, while my father and Ray had been watching the tree line from the other side of the building. Something had come around to the east side and stood there in the dark and put its hand against the wall. And none of us had heard a single thing. My father looked at that print for a long time. He didn't measure it the way he'd measured the prints in the clay by the fence. He just looked at it. Then he went inside, and I heard him talking to my mother in the low, controlled voice he used when he was keeping something out of his tone by force of will. I didn't follow him in. I stood outside, and I looked at the handprint, and I thought about the fact that I had slept maybe 6 feet from that spot, with only a sheet of corrugated iron between me and whatever had been standing there. And I felt something move through me that I can only describe as the floor of my confidence giving way. Not collapsing entirely, just dropping an inch or two, enough to feel it. Ray came around the corner of the house, looked at the print, and said nothing for a while. Then he said that whatever had been at that wall hadn't been trying to get in. If it had wanted in, he said, the wall wouldn't have stopped it. He said it quietly, not to frighten me, just as a plain statement of what he believed to be true. And somehow that was worse than if he'd said the opposite, because it meant the thing at the wall had been doing something else entirely. It had been there for a reason that wasn't about getting inside. And we had no way to know what that reason was. My father added the handprint to the record book that evening. He described the dimensions, the location, the height from the ground. He wrote it in the same flat handwriting as everything else. Then he wrote one additional word at the end of the entry that I only saw years later when the book came into my possession. The word was deliberate, underlined once. The days after that had a different texture to them. I don't know how else to describe it. Before the handprint, there had been fear, real fear, but it had still been attached to something slightly external, something out there beyond the fence, something that belonged to the scrub and the dark hours. After the handprint, the fear moved inside the house with us, and it didn't leave. It sat at the table with us at meals. It stood in the corners of rooms. It was in the way my mother moved through the kitchen now, always facing out, always with a clear line of sight to the door. It was in the way Danny had stopped asking questions, which, for a 10-year-old boy who normally never stops talking, was one of the most unsettling things I had ever witnessed. He just went quiet. He ate what was put in front of him. He stayed close to my mother, and he watched things with this expression I'd never seen on him before. Too old for his face, like something behind his eyes had aged 10 years in a week. Ellie was different. She had always been the kind of child who went still when something was wrong. I'd noticed that from early on. But now that stillness had a new quality to it. She'd stopped asking to go outside. She'd stopped asking for things generally. She would sit in the corner of the main room with whatever she happened to be holding, and she'd look at the walls. Not at anything in particular, just at the walls, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't quite hear. I watched my siblings change over those days, and I felt something harden in me in response. Not courage exactly. More like the thing that sits just underneath fear when there's no option to leave yet. A kind of compressed, locked down functioning. You do the tasks. You get through the hours. You don't look too directly at the thing that's happening, because looking at it fully might be the thing that breaks you open. And you can't afford that. Not with your 10-year-old brother looking to you to be okay. Not with your 5-year-old sister watching the walls. My mother carried it all in her jaw. That's how I always knew what the actual situation was during those days. Not from what she said, because she said very little, but from her jaw. When she was managing something painful or frightening, it would tighten in a way that made the muscles stand out slightly just below her ear. By the middle of that week, she looked like she was carrying something very heavy in her face constantly. She still cooked. She still made sure everyone ate. She still braided Ellie's hair every morning with steady hands. But her jaw never relaxed. Not for a single moment that I saw. And through all of it, through every meal and every sleepless night, and every morning check of the fence line, Ray kept going about his work with a quietness that I only understood much later was not calmness at all. It was the behavior of a man who had made a private decision and was waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. I didn't know that then. I found out the night he finally said it, which was also the night my father heard something that changed the calculation entirely, and after which nothing in the house was ever quite the same again. That night, Ray told us something that my father had never mentioned, and I watched my father's face while Ray said it, and I understood for the first time that my father had known, or at least suspected, and had chosen silence. Ray said he'd worked a cattle run further north when he was young, and the men he'd worked alongside, men who knew that country the way you only know a place when your family has lived in it for generations, had been clear about certain stretches of land. Not in a vague, superstitious way, in a specific, practical way, the way you're clear about which creek floods in the wet, or which stretch of road turns to bog. There were places, Ray said, where you could pass through, and places where you could not stay. The difference wasn't about what you could see. It was about what already owned the ground before you arrived. And the men who had taught him this had not framed it as folklore. They had framed it as fact. The same way gravity is fact. The same way the wet season is fact. Something you account for, or something you suffer. My father sat at the table and listened to all of this without his expression changing. Then he said he'd paid good money for this land, and he wasn't going to be moved off it by a story. Ray nodded slowly. He said he understood. He said he wasn't trying to make the decision for anyone. He was just saying what he knew. Then he picked up his cup and finished what was in it and went outside, and the conversation was over. My mother hadn't said a single word through any of it. After Ray left, she stood up and cleared the cups from the table, and that was that. But I noticed she didn't go to bed that night until well after my father did. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time with the candle burning, and I don't know what she was thinking, but I know what I would have been thinking in her position. I would have been thinking about her children sleeping a few feet away behind a wall of corrugated iron. I would have been thinking about the handprint on the east wall. I would have been thinking about Ray's words and turning them over and measuring them against everything that had happened since we arrived. And I would have been arriving at a conclusion that I was not yet ready to let my husband know I'd reached. What I haven't told you yet, because I couldn't bring myself to talk about it clearly until now, is what that week cost me personally. Not what I saw or heard, what happened to me inside. I was 17 years old, and I was supposed to be the oldest child, the one who held it together, the one my brother looked at to gauge whether something was actually as bad as it felt, and I was failing at that completely. I want to be honest about it in a way I couldn't be for most of my life, because I spent decades being quietly ashamed of it, and I'm too old now for that particular waste of energy. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a stretch. I started hearing things that turned out to be nothing. The house settling, the wind moving something outside, a horse shifting in the yard, and each time my whole body would go rigid and my heart would do this horrible lurching thing, and it would take me 10 or 15 minutes to come back down from it. I started checking the shutters compulsively, pushing on each one to feel that it was latched, going around the room and doing it again 10 minutes later. I didn't tell anyone. I just did it quietly, alone, and hated myself a little for needing to. My father was cleaning the rifle constantly, and I was checking the shutters, and neither of us said a word to the other about it, which is maybe the most honest portrait of our family I could give you. Danny, by that point, had stopped speaking much at all, unless someone spoke to him first. He was eating, he was functioning, but the light behind his eyes had gone somewhere, and I didn't know how to reach in and find it. I tried once. Sat next to him in the evening and just talked about ordinary things, things from before, things we'd done together, a day we'd spent fixing the fence on the south boundary, and how we'd found that enormous goanna sunning itself on the post, and both jumped back like idiots. He smiled at that, a real smile, for just a second. And then it faded and he went back to looking at the middle distance, and I ran out of things to say that felt real enough to matter. Ellie worried me more than Danny. Children that age are supposed to ask for things constantly: food, attention, stories, answers to questions that don't have easy answers. Ellie had stopped doing all of it. She'd go long stretches of the day without saying a word. She'd watch things, the walls, the window, the door, with this quiet, focused attention that felt less like a 5-year-old girl and more like something older wearing a 5-year-old's face. I mentioned it to my mother once, quietly, and my mother's jaw tightened and she said Ellie was fine. She said it in a way that meant, please do not make me look at this directly right now, because I am holding as many things as I can already. I understood. I let it go. I shouldn't have, as it turned out, because 3 nights after Ray's conversation with my father finally worked out what the pattern of the visits meant. He'd been tracking it, I realized later, in his own way, logging the direction the sounds came from each night, the timing, how they moved. And he came in from his watch on the veranda around midnight, and he sat down and he said to nobody in particular that it wasn't random movement. It was a circuit. They were making a circuit of the property in a consistent pattern, night after night, the same rough path, covering the perimeter. He said it the way he'd say a fence needed replacing, flat and precise and completely without comfort. And then he said the thing that made my mother put down what she was holding and not pick it up again. He said the circuit had been getting smaller, each night slightly smaller. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to measure if you were paying attention, which he had been. He opened the record book and showed her the notes. She looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at him and asked him what that meant, the circuit getting smaller. He said he thought it meant they were being assessed, measured. He thought they were deciding something. My mother asked what there was to decide. My father said he wasn't sure, but he thought they were running out of time to figure it out themselves. It was Carol who finally broke it open, and she did it by accident. And I have never in my life seen my father go as still as he went in the moment she told him what she'd seen. Carol was 14. She'd been the quietest one through all of it, which I'd taken as composure, the way older children sometimes go quiet and capable when things get bad, stepping into a role they haven't been asked to fill, but fill anyway, because someone has to. She'd helped my mother without being asked. She'd kept Danny occupied during the worst of the nights by sitting with him and talking in a low voice about nothing, just filling the air with sound so the other sounds outside had less room to land. She'd carried Ellie around when Ellie wouldn't walk. I'd thought she was holding up better than any of us. I was wrong. She was holding a specific thing inside her, something she'd decided not to share, and the weight of it had been sitting on her for days by the time it finally came out. It came out because of something small. My father had been going through the record book at the kitchen table, cross-referencing his nightly notes, when Carol came in from the bedroom and stood near the door and said, quietly, that she needed to tell him something. He looked up. She told him. 3 nights earlier, she said, Ellie had woken up and started to cry quietly in the dark. Carol had picked her up before she could wake the others and had walked her around the bedroom, patting her back, trying to settle her. Ellie was hot and restless, and Carol had done the thing that anyone does with a hot, restless child. She'd gone to the window for air. She'd unlatched the shutter and opened it, just a crack, maybe an inch, just to let something cool in. And she'd looked out through that inch of opening, not thinking, just the automatic thing you do when you open a window, you look out. There was a face looking back at her. She described it carefully, the way someone describes something they've gone over so many times in their head that every detail has been worn smooth and precise. Wide, dark, covered in dense hair that caught the faint moonlight and held it in a way that made the face seem almost textured. And eyes that were catching what little light there was and reflecting it back, the way certain animals' eyes do in the dark. Except the eyes were at the height of the window, which meant whatever the face belonged to was standing nearly upright, directly outside, and the eyes were not looking at the window in general. They were looking at the crack, the specific inch of opening she had made, as if they had been watching the shutter and waiting for exactly this. She closed it. She held Ellie against her shoulder and she pressed her back against the wall beside the window, and she held her own breath, and she waited. She heard the thing move away from the wall after a while, a slow, heavy shift of weight on the ground outside, unhurried, and then nothing. She had not made a sound. Ellie had gone quiet against her shoulder, which Carol said later was the part that frightened her almost as much as the face, that Ellie had simply gone quiet and still the moment the thing was at the window, as if the child had sensed it before Carol had even looked. She hadn't told anyone because she'd been afraid. Not afraid for herself, she said. Afraid of what it would mean for the rest of us if she described exactly how close it had been. because close enough to look through a 1-inch gap in a shutter meant something different from close enough to stand at the fence line or close enough to leave a print in the clay by the perimeter. It meant the distance was gone. And she was 14 years old, and she'd understood that clearly enough to carry it alone for 3 days rather than make the rest of us carry it too. When she finished, the kitchen was completely silent. My father sat with what she'd told him for a long time. He didn't look at the record book. He didn't look at any of us. He looked at the table. Then he opened the book and he wrote the entry. I read it years later. He'd written that one individual had been confirmed at close range, directly outside the east bedroom window, at eye level with the interior, observing through an open shutter crack. He'd written the word observing, not approaching, not threatening, observing, because that was the accurate word, and my father, whatever else was true of him, was always precise about what the evidence actually showed. He closed the book. He looked at Ray, who was standing in the doorway. Ray met his eyes and gave a small nod, like the two of them had been waiting to reach this exact point, and now they had reached it, and the next step was clear. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked back at him with her jaw set and her hands flat on the table and said nothing, because she didn't need to. They had been married long enough that certain conversations happened entirely in the space between two people's eyes. Then my father said it. He said, "We leave at first light." Not we should think about leaving, not we might need to consider. He said, "We leave at first light." And his voice was the same voice he used to say the fence needs replacing, or the bore pump needs a new seal. Practical, final, not a discussion. Carol let out a breath that she seemed to have been holding for 3 days. Danny looked up from the corner where he'd been sitting, and for the first time in a week, something came back into his face. Something close to relief, fragile and raw, but real. Ellie was already asleep in the bedroom. She didn't hear any of it. I sat there and I felt two things at the same time. Relief, yes, sharp and immediate. And underneath it, something harder. The understanding that leaving meant it had won. That the land we'd worked and the fence my father had built and the 4 years of labor and loss that had gone into making that property into something, all of it was about to be walked away from in the dark before sunrise. I kept that feeling to myself. This was not the moment for it. My father had made the call, and the call was right, and I knew it. What I felt about it was mine to carry, and I carried it. And I still carry it now, in a way, 60 years on. That night, nobody slept. We packed in the dark, quietly, taking only what mattered. And the hours between that decision and first light were the longest of my life. At around midnight, every animal on the property started making a sound I had never heard before, and have never heard since. And the sound was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear. Something that came from a place in living things that exists before language and before thought. A place that simply knows. We were all awake. Nobody had even pretended to sleep. My mother had the younger children in the main room with her, close together on the floor, away from the walls. And the candle was burning the way it had burned every night for the past week, throwing its small circle of light and making the corners of the room darker by contrast. My father was at the shutter. Ray was near the door. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the cold stove, and I had been staring at nothing for about 2 hours when the cattle started. It wasn't the sound of animals in panic. I want to be clear about that because panic has a quality of randomness to it. individual voices breaking in different directions, a kind of frantic disorder. This was the opposite. This was every animal simultaneously, all of them finding the same low register and holding it together. A single collective sound that rose slowly from the yard and pressed against the walls of the house like something physical. Like the sound itself had weight. Danny put his hands over his ears. Ellie, who had been half asleep against my mother's shoulder, went completely still and rigid in a way that made my mother pull her tighter and look at my father's back with an expression I am glad she couldn't see me see. My father opened the shutter an inch and looked. He stood there for a long time. Then, in his flat, controlled voice, he said that there were 3 of them at the northern fence, not trying to break it, pressing against it, leaning into the top rail slowly from the outside, and the rail was flexing under the weight, but holding. He said it the way you'd describe weather. 3 of them, pressing the north rail, flexing, but holding. He watched it for what he later told me was about 20 minutes, though it felt much longer from where I was sitting on the floor listening to the cattle hold their low, terrible note. Then he said the pressure had stopped. He waited another few minutes with his eye at the crack, then he closed the shutter and turned around. He said the fence line was clear. He said it quietly. The cattle kept their sound going for another long stretch, that low, communal moan. And then one by one they fell into silence, the sound dissolving from the edges inward until there was nothing left of it. The silence after was the heaviest silence I have ever sat inside. None of us spoke. My father stayed near the shutter. We waited like that until the sky outside began to shift from black to the very first gray of pre-dawn. And then my father said, quietly, that it was time. I have thought about those 3 at the fence for 60 years. The fact that they pressed, but did not break through. The fence wasn't much, we all knew that. If they'd wanted to come through that fence, they could have done it in seconds, and there would have been nothing on our side capable of stopping them. But they pressed and held, and then they stepped back. And I've never been able to decide whether that restraint was a warning, a test, a kind of final statement, or simply the behavior of something operating according to rules I have no framework to understand. I've made peace with not knowing. Some questions don't have answers you can reach from inside a human life. We moved in the hour before sunrise. My father woke those of us who had drifted off in that last gray stretch, and we began loading the horses in near silence. There was no discussion about what to take. My father had worked that out in his head during the night. The horses, the record book, the tin box of savings my mother kept under the floorboard in the bedroom, the rifle, and what remained of the ammunition, that was it. Everything else, the furniture, the tools, the supplies stacked in the outbuilding, the cattle in the yard with their water troughs still full, all of it stayed. My mother moved through the house one time, quickly, touching things without taking them. I watched her do it, and I understood she wasn't looking for things to bring. She was saying goodbye to the 4 years of work that lived in those walls, the garden she'd planted along the south side, the shelf she'd asked my father to build above the kitchen window, the particular way the morning light came through the east shutter when it was unlatched all the way. She touched the edge of the kitchen table with the flat of her hand as she passed it for the last time. That was all. Then she picked up Ellie and went outside and didn't look back through the door. My father was last out. He pulled the door shut and took the padlock from his coat pocket, the one he'd kept hanging on a nail inside the door frame since we'd arrived, and he locked it. I was standing a few feet away with Danny beside me, and I watched him do it, and I felt something catch in my chest. Because it was such a precise and deliberate act for a man who was leaving everything. The padlock meant the door was secured. The padlock meant anyone who came along the road and saw the homestead would see a property that had been locked up properly, not a place that had been fled from in the dark before dawn by a family who'd run out of choices. He wanted that. He needed the appearance of a decision made, rather than a retreat forced. I understood it then. I understand it more now, at 81, than I did at 17. There are things a person does at the end of something hard, not for any practical reason, but simply to keep some small piece of their dignity intact. My father locked that door and put the key in his coat pocket, and turned around and looked at his family on their horses in the gray pre-dawn light. And then he walked to his horse and mounted up. We rode south. My father at the back with the rifle across his knee, my mother in front with Ellie held against her, Ray beside me, Danny on the smallest horse just ahead of us both. The dirt road stretched south in the pale light, and behind us the homestead grew smaller and then disappeared around the first bend in the track. And I watched it go and felt something close behind me, like a door swinging shut, quiet and final. And then we were just 6 people on a dirt road in the early morning, moving south, and the scrub on either side of us was full of the sounds of birds waking up, which was the most normal thing I had heard in 11 days. But we weren't clear yet. Not quite. We were about a mile down the road when something in the western scrub made a sound that stopped every horse dead in its tracks without any of us pulling a rein. Not the calls we'd been hearing at night. This was different. Single, sustained, rising slightly in the middle and then dropping away. And it lasted long enough that I had time to feel my whole body go cold from the inside out while it was still happening. Deep in a way that you felt in your back teeth, and then it stopped. And the silence that came after it was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and the faint sound of Ellie's breathing against my mother's shoulder. Nobody moved. The horses stood absolutely still, which was itself remarkable, because horses that have been spooked don't go still, they bolt. These 5 animals just stopped, like something in them had received an instruction and was waiting for it to be resolved. My father had the rifle up. He was turned in the saddle, facing west, looking into the scrub. I looked, too. There was nothing visible, just the pale trunks of the trees and the early morning light, and the dark between them that stayed dark no matter how long you looked. Nothing moved. Nothing called again. After maybe 2 minutes, my father lowered the rifle. He looked at the tree line for another long moment. Then he turned forward and said quietly, "Keep moving." And we did. I've spent 60 years turning that sound over in my mind. Not trying to decode it exactly. I gave up on that a long time ago. More just living with the fact of it. It felt like a statement of some kind, not threatening, not welcoming, something in between, something that existed in a register I don't have the right vocabulary for, because the vocabulary I have was built for a world that doesn't include what was in that scrub. What I can say is that it felt final, like a door closing from the other side, like something that had been watching us for 11 days had decided the watching was over, and this was the sound of that decision. We had made our choice. Now it was making its own, whatever that meant. And then it was done. We reached the Hargraves property by early afternoon. The family there opened their door without questions and put food in front of us and asked nothing. That evening, after the children were settled, my father sat at their kitchen table with Mr. Hargraves, and told him everything. All of it, from the first morning, in sequence, in the same flat, precise way he recorded things in the ledger. Hargraves listened the whole way through without interrupting once, which told me he was not surprised in the way a person is surprised by something they've never considered before. He was surprised in the way a person is surprised when something they already suspected turns out to be confirmed. When my father finished, Hargraves was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Walter wasn't the first off that land. My father asked what he meant. Hargraves said the family before them had left the same way, before dawn, without their stock. He said a neighbor had driven out to collect them from the road at first light, and that none of them had spoken about what they'd seen. He said the land had been available cheap twice now, and that nobody local had moved to take it up, and that the reason for that, if my father wanted the plain version, was that the people who knew that country didn't build on it. My father nodded slowly. He said he understood that now. He said it without bitterness, which surprised me. He just said it like a man accepting the result of a calculation he'd run too late. He sold the land the following year. Nobody else took it up after that, not for a long time. And when someone eventually did try to run stock from the area, they did it from a distance and never overnighted there and stopped within a few seasons. As far as I've been able to establish, the buildings on our property came down on their own eventually. The scrub tipped them back. The record book sat in my father's drawer for decades. Then Carol had it. Then it came to me after Carol passed. I have it now, on the table beside this hospital bed, next to the water jug and my daughter's notebook. My father's handwriting, the measurements, the dates I've deliberately left out of this account. The word deliberate underlined once on the entry about the handprint. The word observing on the entry about the face at the window. 2 words that together tell you everything about what those 11 days actually were, if you're willing to sit with what they mean. I've been sitting with what they mean for 60 years. Here's what I've arrived at, and I want to say it plainly because I don't have the time or the energy left for anything but plain. We went to that land and we built on it, and we told ourselves it was ours because we had the papers that said so. And the papers were real, and the labor was real, and the intention was honest. But there are forms of ownership that no paper can create, and no fence can establish, and no amount of human effort can manufacture. There is ground that belongs to something before you arrive, and will belong to it after you're gone. And the only question is how long it takes you to understand that. My father was a man who built things and didn't quit. It took him 4 years of living there and 11 days of being shown, clearly and repeatedly and without any ambiguity whatsoever, what the actual situation was. And when he finally understood it, he locked the door and rode south and never went back. Not because he was beaten, because he was, at the end of it, smart enough to read what was in front of him. That is the whole story. That is all of it. The record book is real. The measurements are real. The land is still there, as far as I know, and whatever lives on it is still there. And I think about that sometimes in the way you think about something that exists completely outside your ability to affect it. It just is. It was there before us, and it's there now, and it will be there when everyone who remembers those 11 days is gone. My daughter is going to read this after I'm done. I don't know what she'll make of it. I don't need her to believe every detail. I just needed it written down somewhere outside my own head before I no longer can. That's enough. That's all I was ever going to get from this. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If you had been in my father's position, knowing what you know now about what was on that land before you arrived, knowing the warning signs were there from the beginning if you'd looked for them, knowing that 2 families before yours had already walked away in the dark without their stock, would you have signed those papers anyway? Would the need to build something, to claim something, to prove something to yourself have been strong enough to make you ignore all of it? Be honest. Because most people I've known in my 81 years would have signed, and most of them would have been on that road south before the first 2 weeks were out, just like us. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. There are more accounts like this one, and the people who lived them deserve to have someone listening.